All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. We have quite a few participants or attendees. And this is a bit of a new series for us. So this is our RPI's workshop series. The intention behind this webinar series is that it is a little more technical and focused on some fairly specific content. Many of you have joined us previously for RPI's Webinar Wednesdays, which are the first Wednesday of every month. Those are continuing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. But this is an entirely new series that we're really excited to get started. A little bit of an experiment, so the format may change a little bit. But today, the topic is Perceptive Content Workflow. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have a little demonstration, and then we're going to open it up. So I have a very short slide deck for you. I promise I'm not going to bore you with a really long PowerPoint. I do that the first week of every month anyway. So let's dive in. So just a little bit about RPI first. And by the way, this is being recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel, be sent out, etc. As far as how you can participate, a couple different things. You can submit questions via text. Many of you have already done that via the GoToWebinar questions panel. We're also encouraging you, if you would like to, you can ask questions verbally. Just raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask your question. We can have a little bit of dialogue about it. We can dive right into whatever it is. And then I think you can also use the chat if you want. So RPI, 100 plus consultants, project managers, developers, architects, etc. We're based out of Baltimore. That's where our primary Infor ERP practice is headquartered and located. We also have offices in Tampa and, of course, right here in Kansas City. My team and our office here behind me. We run the gamut of professional services, technical and functional. So whether it's a new installation, an upgrade, migration, implementation, et cetera, we offer it. We are partners with Infor, Kofax, and Highland. We are a Highland authorized solution provider. We have a huge amount of experience with Perceptive Content, Enterprise Search, Brainware, and OnBase. On the solution side, we do a lot of accounts payable automation. We're going to probably end up talking a little bit about this today. And then, of course, into the healthcare with patient records, human resources, on the student side, transcript, processing and automation, and all sorts of things. Many of you know me. You're looking at me right now. Sorry that you have to see me on webcam, but I wanted to make it a little personal. My name is John Marney. I'm the manager of the content and process automation practice here at RPI. So that's all of our work with ImageNow, Brainware, Kofax, Highland, etc. I have over 8 years specifically with ImageNow. That's what I started with, originally from Perceptive Software. Experts, I guess, am I allowed to say that about myself? I don't know, but there it is, in design and implementation of various workflow systems. And I'm a founding father. I have a now 4-month-old little harpy. Okay, upcoming webinars next month in August. We have 2. August is kind of our RPA month. Many of you have probably seen the buzzwords in that as a buzzword in the tech industry. RPA is robotic process automation. It is a very awesome tool. The first webinar is Kofax RPA for accounts payable. The second one, and that's very solution focused to AP. The second one in the afternoon is more technical for tips and tricks on how to implement. Other than that, we are doing a free RPA workshop here in our office in Kansas City. So it's a 2-day course. First day is focused on training. Second day is focused on actually standing up RPA in your environment. You get a 1-year free demo license that can do everything that the full license can do. And you have RPI consultants here in the room working with you, showing you how to do it. It is on October 8th and 9th and includes everything but the travel. So you get yourself here, and we will show you all of the power of RPA. We're really excited about this, and attendance is going to be fairly limited for the first run. So please visit our website to sign up if you're interested. Finally, Community Live. Many of you probably looking at attending. We will be there. September 16th, I believe, is that I think the Sunday or the Monday. It's the Monday, and we're having a happy hour at 5:30 at Bar 32. That is at the top of the Hilton, which is where the conference is. So please come see us. All right. So last slide. What is this workshop? I've talked about it a little bit, but it really is whatever you want it to be. It is a little bit of a demonstration, and I can go as long with that as you want me to, if you don't have any questions or anything you'd like to know. But really, this is meant to be much more collaborative. It's training. It can be help desk for you and your issues. It can be a working session where we work through how to solve a problem together. It's fairly technical. We're probably going to have a lot of rabbit trails off of the main topic, and hopefully a little bit of silliness. I can't do anything too seriously. So that's the intro. Again, please feel free to ask questions. If I have to do an hour of content with no questions, this may be the last one of these we ever do. All right, so I'm going to hop over to our internal environment here, and I'm going to log in here real quick. So I'm going to build just a very small test workflow, just to demonstrate the different, really the mechanism of how it's built, but also to walk through the different types of workflow queues and how it's done. So this is workflow, which is distinct from tasks, which we often refer to as ad hoc workflow. Tasks have their own, probably entire session that can be devoted to them. And so if that's something you'd like to see, please let us know. And actually, if there's any content that you would like to see more thoroughly demonstrated or talked about in a technical manner, please let us know. We have a couple on the schedule for querying and reporting on the ImageNow database and iScripting, which I'm sure is of great interest to many people. I have a ton of various workflows in here. This is our sandbox for my entire team, so you're going to see a lot of junk data in here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new workflow up here on the top right, and I'm going to name it John Test. And open it up, and it will pop open the Workflow Designer. Important to keep in mind that the Workflow Designer can only be opened by one person at a time in your environment, or I should say one workflow can only be opened by one person. So if you ever leave it open on your workstation and you don't have audit log-off enabled and somebody else wants to go edit it, they won't be able to. So good practice, always wrap up what you're doing and close your Workflow Designer. A couple of things before we get started with any of the actual build here. By default, it does not enable the snap to grid and the grid view, so I always turn those on first thing. So this first button, toggle grid, it puts the grid dots into your canvas. And then the second button is snap to grid. This helps you stay organized in your workflow build. Otherwise, you can layer things on top of each other and have things all misaligned. And while I'm not a OCD type person, I do respect that other people are. So what you see here, there are a number of other workflow options along the top of the Workflow Designer for adding comments, for zooming, for drawing routes, and what those routes look like. So I'm going to turn off my notifications real quick, just so we don't get my wife talking to me on video. And then over here on the left, you have the different types of queues, and not all of the queues available are necessarily enabled here. More in a second. Another button, you have routes, and then another button, you have your actions, which we'll dive into. And then here on the bottom, you have the properties of whatever you have selected. So let's get in here. I'm going to pull a work queue out into the environment. And the work queue is your most basic type of queue that you would set up to have users perform actions on documents inside of your workflow. As a best practices approach, over the years we have discovered some various naming conventions that we like to use that you may like to leverage. Let's say I'm creating an accounts payable workflow because I do that all the time, and I feel like I can do it in my sleep. I will generally use the department that I'm building as the first couple of characters. If you are limited to 40 characters here in the queue name, so you do have to be careful what you're doing with it. Then, in order to keep the process in a linear fashion, when you open the workflow in the client, it does list the queues in alphabetical order. But for most users, especially super users who have lots of queues, you want that alphabetical order to often reflect the linear process that the documents go through. So you want to think when you're building, how can I name this queue to be both descriptive of the activity taking place in the queue and what step in the process this is going to take place in. So what we do is we add a number, like 1.0 or something like that, and then what's happening in that queue. All right. If I have any actions such as a routing rule, which we'll probably do a quick build here, with those take place in the Actions tab. This is also where you do iScripts. One important note is that iScripts can only be applied to inbound and outbound. I'm sorry. Routing rules can only be applied to within queue actions. iScripts can be applied to all three. And then alarms, which are your automated alarms. We'll set one of those up. You can adjust the appearance to this specific queue. However, you typically don't want to do that. You instead want to adjust it for the entire workflow all at once, and I'll show you how to do that. Application plans for performing indexing inside of this queue. E-forms, you would add, I'm going to go ahead and add a form here. AP invoice. So that if you do not add this, the form will not be visible inside of the queue. The user cannot look at it. Reasons are for if you're putting an item on hold. You can customize these reason lists. You can add different list members inside of here. Things like contacting vendor, performing research, really just a note to other users why the document is on hold. Removal rules, you have a few options: archive, remove from workflow, delete from system. So let me step through these real quick. Archive means that the document will no longer be visible inside of the queue. However, it means that the workflow history on that document will be retained. Now that sounds like it's a good thing and that you would always want to do that. Why would you never want to retain that workflow history? Well, in a high volume environment where you have a very large workflow, all of that workflow history ends up being stored inside of your database. And if you always retain every piece of workflow history for the entire life of the system, that can cause your database to balloon. So you actually want to make a decision whether you want to retain that workflow history for the entire life of that document or not. Remove from workflow is also removing it from the queue, but actually deletes the workflow history out of the document, and therefore can actually free up some space on the database side, thereby improving performance long term. And then finally, delete from system, right? This is where you would want to, if you ever wanted a queue to just remove documents from the system entirely, you can set it up here. Finally, you can specify the time period that documents have to sit inside of the queue before they can, the removal rule is applied to them. You can set up routes on the queue. You can also set up routes a different way inside of the canvas, so you don't have to do it here. And then finally, you can set up users on the queue. So let's go ahead and add a user. I have a ton of different test users in here. I'm going to add AP processor to this queue. Now, you only want to add users to a queue if they need to interact with it in some way. Now, one thing that trips up a lot of people when building a workflow for the first time is that I'm building this queue. This is an inbound queue, and I maybe want this. I'll build this to route directly to the next queue where the users will actually work. And so you might think, well, if users aren't performing any actions in this queue, I don't need to add them to the queue. However, if they are capturing into the queue, they actually do need to be added and given this add privilege. If you don't do that, when they go to capture and it tries to send it to the queue, the document will error and say the user doesn't have permission. So I'm going to add the AP processor, add privilege, but no others. If they have add privilege and no others, they will not see the queue. They will not be able to manipulate documents inside of it. So I did that. AP 1.0 inbound. So I'm going to create a second queue. It works queue. AP 2.0. Let's call it invoice entry. And I'm going to add the user to that as well. I'm going to give it some different permissions here. I want to give it the process privilege. I want to give it the ability to delete documents out of this queue and archive. All right. 2.0 point on invoice entry. Now, I want to be able to route documents from Q1 to Q2. Now, typically, this is going to, I would probably build a routing rule to do this automatically. However, if I wanted the ability to not route manually, I have to use one of these routes. And there are a few different routes. Sequential and sequential auto are basically the same thing. I'm going to start with sequential. This means that a user would have to route it manually. I'm just going to drag it from queue to queue, right? Now, there are a number of options for formatting here. Our lead consultant, Michael Madsen, requested that I beg of all of you to never use curved routes, which allow you to, I have to redraw the route, to curve the route inside of the canvas, I mean in the queue. I don't know why he seems to have a special hatred for it. Just to demonstrate. Curves, right? And then you can have them angular or you can have them straight, and those options are all up here. So sequential means that the user can click the route forward button and it moves from queue to queue. Sequential auto is kind of a combination of a routing rule and a route, means that it will apply some conditional logic to the route forward and will allow the user to, whereas the sequential will give the user options if there's more than one route forward. The sequential auto will automatically evaluate those options based on the criteria and then move the document. You might think, well, why wouldn't I always want to have an auto route? Why would I force the user to want to pick the queue that it goes to? The problem with that is users often need the clarity or the information of where it's going so that they understand the next step in the process. If you don't present that information to them and forcing them to choose where it goes, they really may not have the best understanding of the end-to-end. Parallel routes so the other two types here are much less used. Let me say, they're basically never used, and for good reason. Parallel routes can actually force the document to split and exist in two queues at once. Parallel routes have to recombine at some point, which means that you are forced to push invoices through documents through parallel processes. It's fraught with technical problems, and there are generally better ways to handle that. But more often than not, we actually would say you don't want documents in same document more than one place at the same time, because there may be conflicting actions being performed on them. Then there is the load balance, which is useful in that it allows you to spread documents across a number of queues. I'm going to show you actually a tip on some other ways to do that. My questions panel here real quick. Okay. Just checking. All right. So I'm going to pull a super queue out here. So a super queue is basically a collection of work queues in that, but it's a way to keep them more organized inside of the canvas and keep them, add a little bit of automation to the setup. So I'm going to make this something like my approvals step, right? I'm going to say 3.0 approvals, and I want to have a separate subqueue for each approver. Most of the same options, but you'll see that subqueues is a new type in here. So subqueues are basically saying I want to have this many extra queues inside of this super queue. So I'm going to click New. I can manually create these, just a manual name like Approver 1, but we typically don't do that. We would either create it automatically based on a user, or a new feature introduced, I believe in 7.15 or thereabouts, is this synchronized queue creation. What this allows you to do is the system will automatically manage the creation and removal of sub-queues based on users inside of a group. So I'm going to pick AP approvers. Then finally, there's what do we want to happen with documents inside of those queues, automatically created queues, if the user is removed. So where do we send those orphaned documents? And so I will pick I'll pick that invoice entry queue. AP 2.0. You can see how I've done this before. Okay, so you can see it automatically created 2 subqueues, one for each person inside of that group.
We have our first question.
All right.
Question is, parallel queues. Would you suggest a document that goes to multiple employees for keying and doing data or different tasks, or sequential? And if sequential, person 2 has to wait for person 1 to finish, correct?
So if you're using parallel queues, the idea is no, you don't have to wait for them to finish. If you don't use parallel queues, then yes, you are forced to use a sequential linear process. So you may think, well, if I want to have simultaneous activities on a document, then why don't I just use the parallel queues? Well, because the documents in ImageNow, ultimately, you cannot keep that split, you are forced to reconcile differences on those documents at the end of that process, which generally speaking is a challenging thing to do, especially if you're using eForms. I would say that if you want simultaneous actions to be performed on the same document at once, you don't use workflow to drive that. You would use tasks instead. Tasks allow you to have multiple tasks opened by multiple users all working simultaneously on the document, but it's still only one version of the document. Instead of having to reconcile those changes down the road, it does it automatically as it's happening. So our recommendation is to use tasks for any sort of parallel processes. Hope that answers the question.
He says, thank you.
Cool. Okay, moving right along. So I have my approval queues. I have 2 approvers, and in most real-world scenarios, the approvers are going to have very specific things that need to come to them. And so maybe I'm going to create a route here. Maybe our clerks that are operating in AP 2.0 would just select the proper approver. However, to demonstrate the load balancing, I'm going to use that. All right, so load balance. So we're going to split these. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay. So there are 2 ways to use there are 2 algorithms basically that the load balance route can use. The first is it has a special algorithm that has a little bit of this little black box that you basically decides, well, if these queues have received the most over a certain time period, don't distribute new documents to that queue. The second option is to always distribute documents to the queue that has the least number of items. That one's challenging because if you have one really efficient person working a lot of documents, then they're going to have the fewest and thereby always get the most new documents rather than. So that's generally not that useful. The first one is probably better for actually distributing. However, I'm going to show you a way in which that actually might, a trick that I was taught when I first started working with this, that actually might be a better, more fair load balance. So I'm going to do that by creating a routing rule. And again, please feel free to submit questions. You can do that anytime. Please interrupt me. If we rabbit trail and go a completely different direction, I'm perfectly okay with that. So if there's anything that you want to know more information on, if you have any questions about what I'm demonstrating here, please just throw it can always return to this. Okay, so I'm going to create a routing rule on this queue to load balance between the AP approvers. So to do that, I'm going to go to Actions, go to Within Queue. I'm going to go to Edit Actions at the bottom. Create a new action. We'll call it AP Load Balance. All right, so this is a way to automatically perform load balancing without needing to use the load balance route. Create a new statement, say load balance. You can name this whatever you want. Create a condition. Okay, so there are a ton of different pieces of metadata that exist on documents. One of which is the document ID, and if you haven't seen the document ID before, it looks like this. I will show you. So the document is like, I think it's like 6 characters and an underscore, and then 10 characters, or 20 or something, 16, somewhere in there. And you can view it by pulling up the document properties. The name is most often the same, also the same as the document ID, but to be sure you can go to details and you'll see the document ID here. So you see, this is a unique ID generated by the system. It uses, I believe, only hex characters, maybe. No, I think it's all characters. But because this is unique, and the last 2 digits, or really probably the whole thing, can be letters or numbers. What that ultimately means is you have 36 different characters that can appear inside of this ID. And so one thing that we can do is actually key off of the unique characters that are somewhat random and split those 36 different possibilities into the number of different divisions we want to send to the parallel queues, or not parallel queues, I'm sorry, load balance queues. So I'm going to create a condition where I look at the content property name ends with. And so, again, I have 36 possibilities, right? The 26 letters of the alphabet and 10 numbers. I have 2 different queues. So since I have 36 possibilities, I'm going to divide those roughly in half. I'm going to say if this ends with T, or copy this and paste it over and over, right? Change these to ors, and ultimately I would say A through T. So just the various letters. I'm not going to do all of them, and then I would use those to route to AP Approver 1. Right, and then I can create a second load balance where that name ends with, the other things. Let's say I have all the numbers, ends with 0, route to 3, or Approver 2. So thereby, I can actually get fairly granular with my load balance, and if I want to assign more, a slightly larger load to one of the sub-queues, I can just, I have the flexibility to change the distribution of which characters get assigned to which sub-queue. Now, this is done via routing rule, which means that the maintenance of this, if you need to go change it, can be sometimes a little cumbersome. I would typically recommend that you build something like this inside of an iScript instead, which we're probably going to do a whole hour on iScript in a future session. But you can do this via routing rule. So I'm going to select that routing rule, apply it to my queue. So that's just a kind of a unique way to approach load balancing inside of workflow. Okay. Other queue types. So you have system queues. Let's call this AP 4.0. export, right? So let's say I have this document with information attached to it. I want to push it out to my financial system or my business system. A system queue is really basically the same thing as a work queue. The only difference being inside of the configuration, you cannot assign users to it, period. It just will not let you. For this reason, I typically don't use system queues because since that is the only difference, there's a lot of people may think because it's called a system queue and can't have users in it that the automated actions lend some sort of preference to these queues, that maybe things move faster or are more efficient. Not true. It is really just the same thing, but it prevents you from ever assigning a user to it. And if this is a mature workflow and you need to go make changes to this later and potentially assign a user to it, that means you're actually forced to delete the queue and recreate it as a work queue if you don't need to do that. So for that reason, I typically don't create system queues. It just allows more flexibility later to create it as a work queue. However, you'll still, commonly find these. And all the other configurations are the same. Managers and owners can still access this queue, so that's why you still have the ability to look at forms, have application plans, things like that. A transfer queue. Now this is going to have to force me to jog my memory real quick. So yeah, a transfer queue allows you to automatically push a document into a new OSM or a different OSM. You may recall the OSMs are your file system structure that actually contain the document images that live on your server. So the OSM, as your system ages, you typically want to implement something called OSM rotation. And then the other use case, just to keep the file groups more manageable. The other reason that you would want to do it is you frequently would push documents of specific drawers to different OSMs. That's a common setup. That's for security, it's for backup, it's for retention management. There are a number of reasons why you would do that. But this type of queue allows you, when the document flows into it, to move it from one queue to another. So if you assign a drawer like AP to the document, by default, when the document's created, it will be sitting in OSM 1 or whatever the default pool is, and then this will allow you to push it out to a new OSM. I don't know if I have a couple extras on here, so I could say I want this document to exist in OSM 5 instead.
We have a couple questions. So the first one is, where would I find the ID for the drawer or document keys?
That is a good question. So, drawer document keys. So the document keys themselves, such as the field 1 through 5, don't have their own IDs. Drawers have IDs. I'm curious, actually. I don't know for sure if you can find this through the management console. Let's explore. So I'm going to go look at drawers, open up AP. Yeah, I'm not thinking there's actually a way to do it through the client. So I know for sure, we can pop over to the database real quick. I know for sure the easiest way to do it, and the way I would always go find this information, would be to run a quick query on the database. And if you look at, these are all the ImageNow database tables. Again, we will have a real fun exploration of these in a future session. But here in this table called IN_drawer, you will have a list of all drawer names with their IDs. So if I do just a quick select on that, you'll see that you have the drawer ID, that's the unique ID for that drawer, the drawer names, drawer description, the department that it exists, and a couple other pieces of information. So that is the that's the most effective way I know to get to that data. There may be some other ways to do it.
Next question, and it may have already been answered. Someone asked, are the OSMs the same thing as drawers? They were looking for a way to send between drawers. Maybe just review kind of how it
looks like they had a follow-up. Never mind, I think you answered my question. I was looking for a way to send between drawers. So it's a good question either way. OSMs and drawers are distinct. OSMs, I'll just show. It's probably easier to show than tell. Back to this is my ImageNow server. The OSMs are the actual file system structures that contain the documents. So if I look at my in-server directory here, I have OSMs 1, 2, 3. Those are your defaults. That's what everybody's going to have. And then I actually have set up a few more for some various technical purposes as sandboxing. OSM1 is the vast majority of your documents. This is going to be huge. So this is where the actual images are archived. So if I just dive into the tree and find the latest file created, you'll see that the images are actually stored as a .osm file. However, it is something else. It could be a PDF, it could be a TIFF, it could be whatever it is inside of ImageNow. And so we don't really have a way of knowing. We can take an educated guess that most of the things that we store are TIFFs or PDFs. Opening this one with Paint, look, it's a TIFF. I opened it in Paint and it loaded, so I know that it's an image file. However, if I tried to open one in Paint that was actually PDF, it would error at me. OSM2 is sub-objects like annotations and eForm XMLs, and then OSM3 is for batches. Batches are the temporary documents that exist before it becomes a real document. So OSM2 is going to be a lot smaller than OSM1, but still have data in it, especially if you use eForms. OSM3 is typically almost empty. It only contains the documents temporarily. Your drawers are 100% separate from those. Drawers are metadata, right, that we assign to those documents. The reason I had mentioned them in connection with each other is because it's frequently your drawers are sort of per department, and you may want to have separate security per drawer on the actual image files. You may want to have separate retention. And so there are many clients who store or have separate OSMs per some specific drawers, and that is where that takes us back to our workflow queue. That's why we have that transfer queue. Hope that answers or adds some clarity there. What else? Anything else? I don't see any new questions. Okay, so sorry.
Follow-up question. What is the best practice when splitting your OSMs?
Oh gosh. So there's two main reasons you would do it. The first is the reason I just mentioned, for security and storing different kinds of documents. The other reason is just to help with the disk management in general. If you are rotating drives in and out, and you need to establish what's called OSM rotation, so that when an OSM reaches a certain size, you spin up a new one, maybe generally on a new disk, or not necessarily, but on a new disk, so that you aren't maxing out the previous disk. And then if you have retention policies in place where those documents actually get deleted at some point, that can actually free up the original disk, which means you can then cycle back your future OSMs onto that original disk. Thereby, it's really mostly a practice for good disk space management. So as far as best practice on when to split, that just depends on the size of your drives and the volume of documents that are coming in.
Follow-up question to that, they have very large OSM, and they were wondering if they're able to split by years. 100%
yes. So you'd want to go ahead, the first step is to create new OSMs for each year. The easiest way to do that is there are a number of in-tool commands. If you're not familiar with those, they're documented out on the Highland portal. I can hop over there real quick. Let's see, where are we? Oh wow, we're already 2:45. So we may not have time to walk through that today, but we'd be happy to do it in a follow-up session. But there are commands to create the new OSMs, and then to actually migrate your existing documents into those OSMs. I think probably would have to be an iScript. There may be some other ways to do it. There is an intool command to actually take a document by document ID and migrate it from one OSIM to the other. You'd have to run that command once per document you want to move. So one way or the other, there's going to be a batch file that has to run some sort of script to manage that. But it's definitely doable. It would be a good idea because typically there are a lot of cases where your retention is done by year for, I think, oftentimes things like students. So that would be a good practice. Cool. Let's try to get through the rest of these queue types. So back in my test workflow here, those are great questions, by the way. A lot of fun to just spill my guts about all these things I've acquired over the years. Tiff Conversion, or a convert form queue. So convert form queues are intended, they have a great intention, however, they don't actually work very well. So if you have an eForm inside of ImageNow and you want to flatten that out and store it as an image which can no longer be edited, there's a ton of different business cases for why we want to do that, and this queue is meant to facilitate that. So I might have a invoice form like I have here, where I want to, form conversion. I want to flatten it out. You specify where it goes if it's successful, where it goes if it fails. You have some conversion options. If you want the JavaScript inside of the form to actually execute, it can do that. And then you say which form and presentation you actually want printed. So the challenge here, though, is that if you think about any given eForm, the data inside of that form may not lend itself to just being flattened out as is. You may have large text areas or even just normal text boxes where the data continues outside of the visible range, and when you flatten the form out, you don't get that. You just completely lose that data. Furthermore, there have just been a number of issues with how this functions technically over the years, where the image quality that it creates is not that great. And so we've had questions from tons of clients over the years. How can we improve this? Or can we improve the way that this convert form queue works? The answer generally is no. We can't really improve the convert form queue. We actually would build a process completely outside of this queue to take those forms and flatten them out in a much better way. But for simple forms, it can still be effective. Next are integration queues. Important to note, I am actually on version 7.15 in our sandbox here. So a couple of these have actually changed some of the things I'm showing. The integration queue is trying to remember. I can't remember if one or both of these have changed. So you have integration queues and you have connect queues. Okay, so this is an integration queue. These have actually been changed a little bit. These actually rely on an Envoy web service to be set up in the management console in order to connect with outside web services. Envoy was removed in 7.2.2, I believe, and so they replaced these with a different queue that functions very similarly. So you see there's, in across department settings, there are, what was here? You should be able to set up Envoy somewhere. I may not be licensed for it, actually. Anyway, Envoy is where you set up a web service to be consumed, and then the queue is actually how you would then interface with that. So the way that this is most typically is that almost all of you probably have is in things like FCC. FCC is File Conversion Component. That's what the automated service that takes PDFs or Word documents or whatever you have and converts them into TIFFs so that they're more easily stored and manipulated in ImageNow. FCC actually utilizes this kind of queue to facilitate the passing of the document back and forth. Looks like we had a question. Okay, we're moving from version 7.13 to 724. I'm not aware of a 724. There's 723 and there's 73. So I'm assuming 723. How can we leverage integration server better in our environment? Currently don't understand integration server abilities or ways to leverage this application. Wow, that's an excellent question. Integration server, it may be deserving of its entire own session. I'm going to try and spend 5 minutes on that here at the end so that I can give you some answers on that. Actually, I'll probably jump into it here shortly. The final queue type is connect queue, which, so these are also typically used with various other sub-processes. I believe that the place where I would probably see this the most are in our brainware integrations. So you would have a queue that would hold documents while the image is being processed in brainware or some other platform, and you see that it has a route after on the failure. So what this would do is actually push the document out of the queue to somewhere else if it hasn't actually received a message back from the other system. This is useful when the other system fails in its communication somehow. So again, I think that the place we would typically see these is in brainware integration or something similar. I will say that the by far vast majority of queues that you'll use in any kind of workflow are a work queue followed by a super queue. Everything else is very specific use case. What else can I cover in 5 minutes? Jump into the integration server. So just to sort of bring this full circle, so any changes made inside of the management console, just as a general tip, you need to restart the ImageNow client before those can be reflected. So you'll see that inside of my workflow list here, and yes, we have a ton, I know it's very messy. I had created this John test workflow, right, and it is not in this list. So what I would actually absolutely need to do is just log out and log back in. And now it will be reflected inside of here. And so you'll see that there's a couple things that I want to just mention just to again come full circle. So you'll see that, so number one, you see these crazy name queues with these unique IDs. This is from me not naming some of the queues that I created. So if you do not name a queue inside of the workflow designer, it will display the queue ID instead of its name. So that can be confusing to users. So I would typically always make sure you don't do what I did and name your queues. But finally, or next, you see that what I mean by actually naming these in a fashion that allows them to be alphabetical. The only downside there is that ImageNow for the sub-queues will use the sub-queue name as the alphabetic order instead of the super queue name. So you see AP approver is showing up here in the A's. And so since these are typically usernames in the sub-queues, those will cause it to be interspersed all the way through. I wish that there could be an enhancement to the product to alphabetize these a little bit differently, maybe by the super queue name instead. But I think all of our wishes for product enhancements to perceptive content are probably just going to fall into a void somewhere. So not a lot of good wishing. But the process is displayed linearly top to bottom. Documents roll into the inbound queue, they go to invoice entry, they go to my AP 3.0 approvals, they go to 4.0 export. So that's the idea, is to give users a linear path through the workflow as it's read. The next thing is that the other reason we name things like this and not just name them purely based on the description of the activity, because it is a little messy to the user, right? AP 1.0, from a user perspective, I would probably just prefer to name this queue invoice entry, right, and skip the other jargon. The main reason we do that is for administrative purposes. So, not much helpful. So if I open the capture profiles to manage these, and I want to create a new document capture, like a scan profile or a ImageNow printer, and I am looking for that workflow queue that I want to send those documents into, this is a list of every single workflow queue inside your system. So if I don't name these in some sort of logical, linear way, it can get extremely cumbersome. And if I have multiple types of approval processes inside of my ImageNow environment, I could have invoices, I could have requisitions, I could have, financial aid, I could have admissions, I could have all sorts of things. You can have thousands of queues in this list. So it's important to keep in mind how you're naming these things when you start the workflow process. So that is some real high-level workflow build. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to submit. Again, we're gonna take a look at this integration server question, but I would love some feedback on the kinds of topics you would like to see workshops on, and I would like a little feedback if you are interested in the things I've mentioned already, the querying the ImageNow database and then iScripting. I think that those are the things that we typically get asked for the most help with, so I hope that there's a hunger for that kind of knowledge. All right, so let's pop out to the Highland documentation. So anybody who doesn't know, this most useful portal for all of their documentation is public-facing, at least for the time being. So docs.highland.com. Don't even need to log in. There is a section on integration server. So integration server is the REST-based or RESTful web services API for inbound and just inbound integration to ImageNow. It replaced messaging agent, which was removed from the product within the last couple of versions, and it is really good. And I think that those of us who integrate with it and use it sometimes can't even appreciate how good it is. For example, OnBase doesn't have a RESTful web service to integrate. You generally have to use the DLL integration for the Unity API. So for this being available for ImageNow is actually really fantastic. I think it's really well documented, and even newbies can go out and get information out of this. So I'm on 715, so I'm going to go to the online help. And really, there's quite a bit here, but the meat and potatoes is in your operations. So these are all of the API calls that you can make to integration server. They don't support everything. So future releases, including 7.3, the major features in 7.2.3, 7.3, and in the future are going to be updates to integration server and to facilitate better integrations, but also to facilitate the experience platform. So let's say I want to do something as simple as store a document. There are versions, and so when integration server was first released, it only had version 1 of all these, right? And then over time, they add features, but to retain backward compatibility, they have to still support the older versions of those web service calls. So if I want to store a document on the ImageNow server, I have this post document. And if you expand all of the information about this, you can see the different criteria. Usually the most useful thing is to look at the samples. So you can see here's a JSON sample of the information that needs to be passed to create a document. You have your index keys, you've got your properties, things like that. So the question was, how can I better use integration server to integrate with my environment? So that's a really loaded question, and it really just depends on your use cases and what you need to do. I would say that one way is many business applications that we see. Many business applications have URL links, say to WebNow or something, so that users can view a document from inside of the record inside of the business application. Maybe that's Lawson, maybe it's PeopleSoft, maybe it's Oracle EBS, maybe it's SAP, whatever it is, right? Those have their own problems, some related to the clients, some related to the fact that that document may not exist, et cetera. We're working with a couple of schools right now who use PeopleSoft, who are converting their PeopleSoft to, instead of using these or either older API calls or URL calls to fetch documents, they're actually fetching documents through this integration server call. So what they're doing is they're building out this integration server get document. It can perform searches and return results back to the ERP. It can actually fetch the actual document and the image. You could have, if you have some sort of workflow system outside of ImageNow, maybe you're doing some sort of approvals inside of your business application, but you still want to track and move documents inside of the ImageNow workflow so that history is reflected on the document. You could go to the workflow calls. I don't know which one it is. Workflow item, maybe. You can actually, I think it's workflow item. You could actually route that document inside of the ImageNow workflow without anybody needing to log in and do it. There are just really anything that you can possibly imagine. You can do most of it through integration server, and yeah. So really the biggest thing is any integrations from any other applications that need to happen probably want to happen through here. Okay. Let's see. Did we get any other questions?
Nope. Just a couple great suggestions on future workshops.
Yeah, good. Someone told me next time more baby pictures. I will accommodate. iScripts would be a great demo. Yeah, we're definitely gonna do that. I will warn you that doing an hour of iScripts is basically a drop in the bucket. But workshopping creating application plans with learn we can totally do that. Including we can walk through the newest supported method of using the apt-get tree script instead of the apt-get data. Cool. Okay, well, that's pretty much all our time for today. Again, this recording will be available and made available and distributed. Invite your friends to the next one. We are planning on doing this every month, so probably roughly a month from today. We'll have our next one, and we'll get some information out about what the content will be. I think we were planning on doing the database querying one. I don't know. Might shift that to do the iScript one instead, but we'll see. So thank you so much for attending. Please feel free to reach out to us. This is what we do. This is what we live. This is what we love. Always happy to help with your ImageNow and other pieces of software. So thank you, and have a good day.